that okay? Is that okay? Okay. And Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. How much more valuable are you than birds? Who, who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wildflowers grow. They do not labor or spin, and I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothed the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it, for the pagan world runs after such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and all these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that do not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail. There is no thief comes near, or no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also."
Kathryn? Your microphone looks lovely. Just going to pray for Kathryn. Thank you, Lord, for Kathryn. Thank you, Lord, for her wisdom, and thank you for everything that she's put into preparing this talk for us tonight. Lord, I just pray that you would give her peace, that you would give her confidence, Lord, that she's going to bring us your word. In Jesus' name, amen.
Great, good to see you here today. I'm liking the Christmas jumpers. I watched my first Christmas film this afternoon whilst making my Christmas cake, so I'm sort of getting into the spirit of it slowly. Ironically, I'm always a bit nervous when I speak. This time I've been so nervous, been worrying all day. Felt sick today. I was so worried. So I'm not really taking on board what I'm preaching on, am I? So I asked Paul earlier on today, on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 somebody who doesn't worry at all to 10 where somebody that is overwhelmed by worry, where would he put me? And he put me on a 4 or 5, which I didn't think was too bad actually. I'd probably sort of say probably 6 on a bad day. But worry is a thing, isn't it? That some of us are more laid back and don't worry as much, and some of them struggle with it more. But there's very, very few of us who don't worry about something at some point in our lives. I think you'd have to be completely without care or concern for anybody else if you didn't worry at all. So it is a big deal. So I think one of the ways that I sort of try and manage worry is I try and control things, I suppose. I try and put in place things so that things go well, so I don't have to worry about it. So I do things like I exercise and I eat well, so I stay healthy. And, I've got a savings and a pension and, all those things that you're supposed to do. I get the car service, all those things that might cause issues or whatever, we try and manage and I try and control. Unfortunately, there is so much of the world that's outside of my control, isn't there? At the moment, as particularly, I think there's so much going on, isn't there? So I do worry about my children, I worry about my family and my friends, I worry about my work. There's all sorts of things that I worry about. And then, we look at the news and, I've watched the news ever since I can remember. John Craven's news round, I used to really enjoy. And so it's always been part of my life. But I have to say, at the moment, I'm really struggling to watch the news because there's so much that it just feels quite overwhelming, doesn't it? I mean, I remember, again, growing up, there was quite a lot of things to worry about back then. I mean, the Cold War was a big thing, wasn't it? And I can remember worrying, well, if that, was it 4 minute or 5 minute, one or the other, warning went off and I was at school, I wouldn't be able to get to say goodbye to my mum and things like that, you know. And there was IRA bombings and things like that. So there were a lot of worrying things around. But I think at the moment now, it's the communication that's around is so much greater, isn't it? So we get to know so much more of what's happening in the world. So whether it's Palestine or Syria or Ukraine, all sorts happening further afield. And then in our country, you know, the things like racism and poverty and politicians that don't seem to know how to even start to deal with things. So it's not really surprising that we're facing a bit of a mental health crisis, and anxiety is such a massive issue. So Jesus knows us better than we know ourselves, and so he is really aware that as human beings we have a tendency to worry. And that's why he in the middle of his sermon puts in this passage about not worrying, not being anxious. I don't find always people telling me not to worry is particularly useful, is it? You know, say, oh, don't worry, it'll be fine. You think, well, how do you know it will be fine? You know, what are you basing that statement on? And that's the thing is, you see, Jesus does have good things to base his statement about not worrying, about telling us not to worry. And he also gives us ways of helping us not to worry. He gives us solid information and ways that we can deal with worry. So he starts this particular passage with a therefore. It does in my translation anyway. I'm not sure about the one we just read. I can't remember. But when people translated the Bible, originally, you know, it didn't come, did it, with all the nice verses and chapters and the headings that are helpful. And sometimes, though, that can get in the way a little bit because we look at the Bible as chunks rather than a whole narrative. But when there's a therefore, it means that we need to read what went before to understand what Jesus is talking about now. And so we need to think about what went before this bit about worry. And on first reflection, the bit leading up to this passage, I don't find particularly reassuring. So Jesus talks about judgment, he hints at persecution, and he tells a parable about the futility of planning and the fragility of life. Not really topics you'd usually use to try and give people reassurance, I don't think. The parable is of that very successful man who was so successful, he said, right, I'm going to build these great big barns and fill them up. You know, he was doing really well for himself. I think he was feeling quite pleased with himself, quite self-satisfied, no doubt thinking that he'd secured his future. However, he just dies suddenly in his sleep, just like that. And all that work and all that stuff that he'd accumulated was worth nothing. It didn't benefit him at all. Well, that's not the most cheerful story. Perhaps not one for the bedtime story for the kids, you know. However, Jesus doesn't give false promises. He's not going to tell us that everything's going to be all fine if it's not. He knows that the reality is that actually sometimes bad things happen. Sometimes the reality is that not everything goes to plan. Sometimes we have to go through difficult times. So in this chapter, Jesus is encouraging us to think in a way which is a bit countercultural. And I think this phrase that really grabbed me from this particular passage was the seek first the kingdom of God. And so I suppose that's really what I've been focusing on in my planning for today. Jesus knows that this life will pass, and we are working for an eternal life with him. He knows that one day all these things that we struggle with will be gone, and we'll be living a life with him that's free from worry and is amazing. But we're not there yet. But that sort of picture of where we're aiming for, that gives us hope. It gives us hope that whatever happens to us now, there is a future for us, which is absolutely amazing. So Jesus is like wanting to encourage us to think about how we seek his kingdom, instead of worrying about all those things that we don't have any control over. And I suppose we go back to Peter walking on water again. I mean, I read this often, and it was when he took his eyes off of Jesus, wasn't it, and looked at the stormy waters around, that he started to sink and the water started to overwhelm him. When he had his eyes on Jesus, that was when he was above the water and was safe. And so that focusing on Jesus' kingdom, what is important to Jesus, what he would do, is what we really need to hang on to. So this particular account of not being worried is in Luke, and also it's in Matthew, in almost exactly the same passage. In Matthew, I find the account really helpful. It's situated as part of the Sermon of the Mount. And, you know, I have read this so many times, and I really saw some new things when I was preparing today, which is really quite exciting. So one of the other things that is contained in the Sermon of the Mount is the parable that any of us who have grown up in Sunday school will know really, really well, and that is the wise and foolish builders who built one built their house on the rock and one built it in the sand. And do you know, I've read this parable so many times, and I'd never really sort of cottoned on to the fact that this was in the middle of the Sermon of the Mount. I think because I knew it so much, so well, it was almost too familiar, and I could read it and don't really think about it. And if you'd asked me, I thought, oh, well, building your house on the rock, oh yeah, that's having trust and faith and all that. And I thought I knew what it meant. So I'll read it to you now. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. That was the bit of the song that we used to sing that we all loved, wasn't it? You know, when so I'm not a singer, maybe Kate will sing it to you later. As I said, it's so familiar. So Paul and I had some first-hand experience of a storm and some flood water the week before last. Is there a picture somewhere? Have you got the? Can you put it up? There. Okay. So that there is me, just there on that picture. So we had a few days off, and we were going down to West Wales to our caravan. Yes, there were some warnings of wet weather, but it's West Wales. There are always warnings of of bad weather, wet weather, aren't there? So we were driving on the motorway, and it was not very nice, and there was a crash. So we came off the motorway, and it was dark, and we were going down the country roads, and we couldn't really see where we were going, and some of the water we drove through was a little bit scary. And then we were driving on a little bit further, and the traffic announcement would come on, and the roads we'd just come through, they were announcing were now shut because they were flooded. So we knew the caravan site would be all right because it's higher up. So we got a quarter of a mile away, and we were flagged down because the road was impassable. So we had to get our rucksacks and put enough clothes and food for a night in our rucksacks. We couldn't go back because the roads were behind us were closed, and we had to wade through floodwater in order to get to the caravan for the night. And honestly, you see the water and it looks, it's wet, and you think, oh, this is going to be cold. But the surprising thing is the pull of that current as you walk through it. And I was a little bit ahead of Paul, and at one point I'd said something to him and he didn't get an answer. And so I looked round and I couldn't see him, and I thought he'd been like fallen over and it was sort of drowned or something. But no, he was taking this photo of me. So, and again, over the end of last week, I mean, the floods in Monmouth were terrible, weren't they? And you could see the power of that water that had knocked, walls down. Really quite scary. And, for the people whose houses have been flooded, your home is the place where you feel safe, isn't it? And even if they haven't been knocked over, to have them filled with water, your sanctuary, that must be just absolutely awful, mustn't it? So I think going through that helped me identify a little bit more with this parable. I mean, the local people said they'd never seen anything like it, it was just horrible, really. I thought it was quite an adventure, but there you go. So the one thing that the wise and foolish builders had in common, as well as the fact that they built a house, was they both experienced a storm. So the fact that the wise builder had built on the rock didn't make him immune from the storm itself. It meant that he stood firm within that storm. And I think it's very clear from this that being a Christian does not prevent you from being buffeted by difficult things. It doesn't prevent hard things happening. Sometimes illness, bereavements, job loss, financial worry, all these things. It doesn't necessarily mean that we won't go through some of those things. But looking at this parallel again, it says that Jesus says that everyone who hears his words and puts them into practice is like the builder building his house on a rock. So he's not talking about faith or trust, which, are really important things in terms of building foundations on God. But here he's talking about putting his words into practice. That's how we build on the rock. So what words did he mean? Well, he means the teaching he'd just been given, what we now call the Sermon on the Mount. We did a series on it. It wasn't very long ago, was it? We did a series on the Sermon on the Mount, which was really good. And we looked at all the different parts of it. And it basically gives guidance on how we should live. And some of the things in it are really quite hard. So there's things like forgiveness rather than holding things against other people, not putting yourself in the way of sexual temptation, loving your enemies, giving to the needy, concentrating on what's of eternal significance rather than what's temporary, not judging others. If you're thinking about ways of becoming less anxious, it doesn't immediately come into your head that these are the sorts of things that you need to be doing, does it? You might think about self-care, and that's really important. It's important to look after us. But the things Jesus asks us to do here are what he would do. They're all about other people and our attitude to other people. That's what Jesus meant by seeking his kingdom first. And it's interesting if you think about those things, although they might not, automatically seem things to stop us worrying, they are actually all things that help our mental health. So research shows that it's a lot better for our mental health to forgive than it is to be resentful. Giving releases feel-good hormones like dopamine. Judging others can worsen anxiety, depression and self-esteem. So actually, thinking about other things, others, as as an antidote to anxiety is not as strange as at first it seems. But they aren't easy. None of those things that Jesus asked us to do are easy. And I think that here, the building analogy is really important, because we sometimes want instant fixes. Well, I want instant fixes. I want to stop worrying now. I want everything, fixed right now. And that isn't realistic, isn't it? It's not the way it is. But building, especially if you're building well, takes time. It takes effort, and so building our life on that foundation of Jesus takes some work from us to do it really, really well. And there are some other things in the Sermon on the Mount that help us with that. It includes the teaching on prayer and the Lord's Prayer, and that relationship we have with Jesus, with God, is so important, isn't it? To building on that foundation with Him, and to helping us to do what He wants us to do. There's fasting in there as well, which is, again, something none of us find easy, but in terms of helping us in our relationship with God, really important. And there's lots of bits in there about asking God for what we want, because He's a good Father and He cares about us. So I had an English teacher called Mrs. Carter, and she was a stickler for proper English. So if we ever used mixed metaphors in our writing, we got into trouble. So sort of a mixed metaphor is when you use two figures of speech together that don't really go together and don't really quite make sense. So an example of this was Craig Bellamy, the Wales football manager, once said about someone else, "He's gone behind my back right in front of my face." So that's a mixed metaphor. So Paul had no such qualms about mixing his metaphors. So in Corinthians 2, 6-7, he writes, "So then, just as you received Christ as Lord, continue to live your lives in Him, rooted and built up in Him, strengthened in the faith you were taught and overflowing with thankfulness." So here we are to be both rooted and built up in Jesus. So a nice mix of building and gardening metaphors there for you. Now, Mrs. Carter was one of the best teachers I ever had, and I owe a lot to her, but I actually disagree with her on the mixed metaphor thing. I think they can be really, really powerful. So the building metaphor fits in what we've been talking about already, in terms of we need to be active in building our lives on Jesus. But having strong roots is also essential. Yes, they keep us as firm and to stand against the storms. A tree with deep roots will be less likely to be knocked over than one with shallow roots. But the difference is that the roots draw nourishment from the ground. And so here, Jesus requires us to do our part in building, but through the Holy Spirit, He provides us with the sustenance and what we need to do that. And Jesus promises in this wonderful passage that if we seek His kingdom first, that He will deal with everything else. As I said, it's not like He's going to make everything magically better, but He does love to bless us, and He does care about all the things that we worry about as well. In fact, He cares more than we do. I know He cares more about my children even than I do, and I love them more than I can possibly say. So one day as well, there's that eternal promise, isn't there, that we have, that Jesus will overcome all of this, and there will be that day where everything will be how it should be, how He intended to be as well. So I feel like I perhaps have, I don't know, maybe disappointed some of you, because I haven't really come here today with some magic answers and how to stop worrying. And I don't have magic answers on how to stop worrying. There are things that I do which help me not to get overwhelmed. So praying, being wise how I use my time, sharing worries with others, listening to worship music to drown out the anxious thoughts, making sure I do things which are fun and enjoyable, and focusing on positive things, exercising, eating healthy, all things that I do to try and look after myself. But what I can say to you is that throughout the 50 odd years that I've been a Christian, I've been through quite a lot of storms. And I know from my experience that keeping my eyes on God, relying on Him and trying to live as He wants me to is how I've come through those storms. And, you know, I think looking back over my life as well, I can say that when I was in my 20s, I probably was a 7 or 8 on that scale of worry. So I feel like it's sometimes hard work living that way that Jesus wants us to do. It's hard work, we to try and cling on to Jesus, but it's worth every effort. It's worth everything that we have to put into that. And as I said, He is our Father. He loves us. He cares for us. And the other thing I can say without a doubt is that He cares about your worries. 1 Peter 5:7 says, "Cast all your anxiety on Him because He cares for you." Just because He hasn't prevented this, or doesn't always prevented the storm, doesn't mean He doesn't care when you go through it. And He will give you the strength and the comfort to come through it. Oh, thank you, Anne. Thank you. Appreciate that. So that's really all I was going to say today. But we're going to go into sort of a period of worship now. And, there may be people here that you're really battling with some anxiety, some worry about something right this moment. And we are a family here. We are here to support one another. God's given us each other to help and support each other. So if during the any point in the time of worship, it's going to be a nice long one, so you've got plenty of time to think about it. If you want somebody to pray for you, there's plenty of people around here that would be happy to pray. I know Peter and Kathryn are always happy to pray, and Georgie, and anybody that you feel comfortable with, really. Just grab, or Claire, just grab somebody and ask for that prayer. Don't go away from here without having that prayer.